You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
This was President Donald Trump's statement on Election Day in 2024. But 2 years later, things have turned out like this. The US and Israel officially launched a preemptive strike against Iran. In fact, that scenario is not at all unfamiliar. President Obama kept his promise in Iraq. But when his term ended, the press wrote that or nearly 100 years ago. Just 1 year after the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States officially entered World War II. Many presidents have made many promises, but the results have always been the same. Throughout history, America has seemingly been unable to stop waging war. But why not? Look at this map. In 1776, the United States was just a narrow strip of land comprising 13 colonial territories along the Atlantic coast. But just over 100 years later, their territory stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and much of that territory was not acquired through. It began with the War of Independence in 1718. Britain then helped the United States gain control of the Great Lakes region. Pound 17 drove the Spanish out of Florida. Alongside these were decades-long wars with our indigenous allies. They own. And when the majority of the indigenous population is gradually wiped out, each war brings land and an ever-deepening belief that force solves everything. The 1846 war with Mexico, the clearest illustration of this. President James Park wanted California to take over the entire, but Mexico refused to sell. Park immediately dispatched troops to the disputed territory, waiting for the opportune moment to declare that Mexico had shed American blood on a man. As a result, Mexico lost more than 36 million square kilometers of present-day California, Texas, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. China is using this as an excuse to escalate the situation and then seize land or expand its territory. This pattern has been repeated throughout history. By 1898, having exhausted its land-based objectives, America turned its attention to the ocean. In just a few months, the Spanish-American War gave Washington control over Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. However, the US military at that time was still only ranked 19th in the world in terms of size, until 2 competitions changed that number. The first instance of this was the first time the US deployed a large-scale military force outside with 2 million soldiers sent to Europe. This also marked the first time the United States reorganized its entire economy to serve a shift from shipbuilding to ammunition production lines. All of this is coordinated by the federal government. As this historian once observed, the first market was the beginning of the modern American military. However, new military capabilities do not necessarily equate to global ambitions. The US withdrew when the war ended. Throughout the 1920s and 90s, oppositionism in America grew stronger than ever. By 1937, 7% of American poll believed that joining the First World War was a mistake. But World War II changed everything. The US decided to pursue military action after the Peril of the Orient event, when its already struggling economy was flooded with military spending. When the war ended in 1940, the United States possessed atomic weapons, controlled the Bretton Woods financial system, and had a military presence on 3 continents. From a newly emerging power, they have risen to the position of writing the rules for a new world order. But the biggest difference lies in what happens after the victory. In 1945, whenever a war ended, the United States demobilized its soldiers, downsized military apparatus, and returned them to civilian life. After World War II, for the first time in history, that didn't happen. The U maintains a standing army, deploys hundreds of military bases globally, and has developed a fully operational arms industry. This decision stemmed from the fact that the Soviet Union was expanding its children's education system. The Cold War had, and the smell of threat was real. The needs to be prepared for any eventuality. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the US defense budget only decreased slightly for a decade before increasing sharply. Again, there was someone who foresaw this early on. January, in a speech from the sea, and how famously warned, "It is clear that war has shaped America from 13 coastal colonies to a global superpower. Each leap was accompanied by gunfire, especially after the Second World War. The US created a military industry that always needed war to survive. So, how does that industry actually operate?" Before answering that question, CD Media would like to introduce the house featured in this video at the main marketplace. The world's leading VPN service. One account can be used on the 14-device. Data encryption gives you peace of mind when using public Wi-Fi and supports access to content from over 100 countries at the highest speeds currently available. Specifically, register via the exclusive link for CD Media audience to receive an additional 4 months of free usage. Britain, France, and Russia all expanded their power through war, but none of them allowed any of those nations to create public traded defense corporations. Some shareholders or legal entities have the authority to maximize quarterly profits. The American woman did it, and it changed everything. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US defense budget fell from 6%
GDP
to just 3% in the late 1990s. Former Deputy Secretary of Defense William Perry was blunt about this. "We expect defense companies to go bankrupt. We'll just stand outside and watch." On 1993, Secretary Aspin and Deputy Secretary William Perry invited approximately 1,000 defense industry CEO to dinner at Longines. The message was very clear: the budget would be cut, and there not be enough money for everyone. Merge or go bankrupt. As No Trap merged with Gaiman. Let merged with Modern Marietta. While Boeing acquired the Donald Douglas Inc. cartridge. In less than a decade, major contractors were consolidated into 5 conglomerates: Lot, Ron, Boeing, General Dynamics, and the intention was to streamline the system. But the result was a market where just 5 companies controlled more than 50% of the corner hot cage contracts, with no competition. Can't be driven down. The land structure of the contract further escalated the issue. Most US defense contracts follow the C+ model, meaning the government pays only what the contractor spends, with no additional fixed profit margin. It sounds reasonable, but it's actually a huge loophole. The contractor loses nothing when all expenses incurred will be borne by the government. So there's no reason to save money. The F-35 program is an example. The initial estimated cost was around $2 to $40 billion, but the total lifecycle cost has now exceeded to $1 trillion. Or consider Viet Nam presidential program, which initially had a budget of $6 billion, then ballooned to $13 billion before being completely cancelled. The project ceased to exist, but the contractor was paid all expenses incurred during development. The government bore the loss, while the contractor still profited, and almost no one has dared to monitor this money. The Department of Defense is the only federal agency that has never passed a typical financial audit. In 2023, when auditors attempted to verify $3.8 trillion in assets, 63% which were unverifiable. From an investment perspective, this is almost a perfect model. The US defense budget increased from approximately $64.5 billion in 2014, nearly $1 trillion in 2024. That figure is larger than the combined defense budgets of the next largest country. And since there are only 5 major corporations left, they all understand that no one should undercut or obstruct, but rather they should all benefit together. From a personal perspective, you could double your returns on defense stocks after each crisis in China. To put it more broadly, if you had invested 10,000 in Lockheed Martin stock on May 10, 2001, 11 months before the attack, that amount would now be worth 2 to 50,000 if you reinvested the dividends. However, if you invest according to the S&P 500 index, which measures the 500 largest companies in the United States, that 10,000 would only grow to about 1,000. From a purely financial perspective, warfare is a spectacularly profitable investment for companies like Google, Apple, and success means optimizing prices, quality, or providing better customer service than But in the defense industry, success means continued spending, continued contracts being signed, and continued deals remaining on the agenda. The painting doesn't end there. Weapons are not the only avenues that benefit from war. The second well is oil. Whenever conflict erupts in the Middle East, rise there doesn't need to be an actual disruption to the supply. Simply the possibility is enough for the market to drive prices up, and these two cash flows are. In 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Zeta in such secrecy that even the U.S. ambassador to Seoul was not notified. His task was to negotiate an agreement that would remain secret for 41 years. Accordingly, ARS is committed to reinvesting its oil revenue, Treasury bond, in exchange for military security guarantees and the right to purchase weapon. There is no legal provision that forces the sale of oil in dollars. But the practical result is that the global oil financial system operates around the US dollar, thereby forming a filtering loop. The countries that recently sold oil earned dollars and then bought American weapons. The escalating tensions surrounding weapons and the pipeline are driving up oil prices. Further, the oil-producing priests collected dollars and then used the money to buy more weapons. Between 2015, it became the world's largest importer of weapons. 73% of them came from the United States. Oil prices plummeted in 2050. Military spending immediately decreased by 30% in just 1 year. That means $8 billion has vanished. Oil prices go up, arms prices go up, oil prices go down, arms prices go down, with rates remaining at or below. This cycle never ends. And the Middle East is the only place in the world where both flows of money converge. This is seen as the reason why this region has always been a top priority for Washington over any other hots. But even the most profitable business model needs people to run it. The corporation needs leadership approval for its strategy, while the government needs officials to approve the contract. And sometimes those two professions are the same. An industry that profits from war cannot sustain itself without protectors within the political system. The arms corporation cannot vote on budgets on its own, nor can it sign orders to deploy troops. They need the long-standing group that occupies the corner of the White House. And they secured these three places with 3 layers. The first layer is money. In the most recent election cycle, the majority of you received contributions from Defense Day. Arms corporations are seeking nearly $150 million in additional lobbying funds, and that money isn't being distributed evenly. Those who vote in favor of increasing the military budget will receive 7 times more funding than those who abstain. This pattern repeats each year when Congress votes on the National Defense Authorization Act. This document determines how much money the South Corner building will receive for the next year. Despite much debate, it has been given the opportunity to pass for 64 consecutive years. However, the money going into the pockets of parliamentarians is only part of the story. Another lies in the voters' ballot through the second class of employment. For example, the F-35 program span, creating 1,000 direct and indirect jobs. It's not because the supply chain needs such a drastic measure, but because once all 50 states have jobs, all the congressional groups will defend the program at. Cutting F-35 means cutting jobs in my hometown. No. Explain that to the voters. Republicans and Democrats can disagree on everything from immigration and taxes to healthcare and abortion. But the defense budget was the only thing they both agreed on. Money buys parliamentarians job. But the machine still needs another layer to prevent anyone from breaking it from the inside. That is the system of personnel rotation. Approximately 80% of retired 4-star military officers transition into roles as consultants or lobbyists for defense corporations. Many of them go on CN or Fox to analyze the military situation whenever there is a conflict, but in my capacity as a national security expert, not as a weapons advisor. Lloyd Austin is the clearest example. With over 40 years in the military, he was the commander of the Central Command, responsible for the entire Middle Eastern theater of operations. He retired in August shortly after. Austin joined the REL board of directors. Over 4 years, he received a total of approximately $7 million from them. In December, Joe Biden unexpected nominated Lloyd Austin to be Secretary of Defense. The problem is that state law requires generals to wait at least 7 years after retirement before being eligible to take on this role. Austin only been retired for less than 5 years. The ordinary voters granted an exemption to the 93-year-old man who was married to 2 women. And during Austin's tenure, it was no surprise that Ton secured over $30 billion in additional contracts from the very same building he headed. Each person in the system acts according to their own individual perspective. So what happens when this system encounters real resistance? The Battle of Viet Nam was the first major military defeat in American history. As a result, defense budgets decreased over the course of a decade. Then Reagan took office in early 90. The budget surged again, exceeding even Vietnam War levels, and has never since fallen back to its previous level. External opposition only slows down the machine. It doesn't stop it. Even if the president wants reform, the system will still find a way to replace it. In 2013, Barack Obama appointed Chuck Hugo as Secretary of Defense, former senior officer and Vietnam War veteran, who openly advocates for cuts to the defense budget. At that time, Congress had just passed legislation imposing widespread automatic budget cuts, resulting in losses of tens of billions of dollars. Obama needed a minister willing to streamline the bureaucracy, and Hugo was the perfect choice. He completed the task efficiently and effectively. But as he rose to prominence and prioritized a policy of military, Ho was replaced by a more hardline figure. The system involves recruiting the right players for the downsizing phase and then replacing them with the right players for the climbing phase. But Hugo was only a minister. But what if the president himself wants to make a change? In 2008, Obama won the election largely because of his opposition to the invasion of Iraq and his promise to end the unmanaged war. After taking office, he effectively closed down the CIA's secret, banned torture, and began withdrawing troops from Iraq. But Obama also increased troop levels in Afghanistan by 1,000 to reduce American casualties. He switched to using ground-powered UNCs, thereby limiting the deployment of American troops into the terrain. A rigorous legal process was personally reviewed by Obama on a weekly basis for each attack. Everything is well organized and under control. The result of this process was 560 drone attack, 10 times the number carried out during Bush's entire tenure. The Obama administration dropped 1 bombs in 7 countries. The task force operates in 138 countries, representing 70% of the world's female population. It's clear that Obama didn't narrow the war, but rather created a more streamlined and less controversial version. He entered the White House with the intention of making changes, but then left after having helped the war system function more smoothly than ever before. In 5, President Donald Trump signed an order renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. In fact, this name was used from the department's founding in 1789. President Trump is now simply restoring the department's original name, which is more appropriate and functionally relevant, because it spans the entire length of history. America is not defensive, it's guiding principle. Thanks to their offensive tactics, they have gained and continue to gain countless advantages. Perhaps, as long as they remain at the pinnacle of world power, Americans will continue to wage wars